Hello and welcome to Unit 5. So in this unit, we're looking at the kind of the political and social situations of the 19th century. So here are some of the important topics. So the 19th century is really characterized by change, by struggles and compromises politically between liberals and conservatives. New nations were emerging, the end of some old nations. Um, and yet at the same time it was a period, and there were lots of revolutions, but in reality it was a time of mostly peace. And the peace came about because following the Napoleonic era, the leaders in Europe believed that they could no longer sustain prolonged wars like they had just gone through, and so they crafted political arrangements that were meant to actually maintain peace. And it worked for the most part until the First World War. And of course, we're going to talk about that later. But and they made all of these alliances, to keep the peace, and then it all kind of blew up, in 1914. So the Congress of Vienna is where the victors of the Napoleonic Wars met to set the rules, and it was dominated by the Austrian Empire, Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, and France. And one outcome was pretty much a redrawing of the map of Europe. And part of that was to take away all those territories that the French had won in those wars, led by Napoleon. And the new political order became known, probably after the fact, as the Concert of Europe. And it was a conservative international political network of these five powers, and it was devoted to peace, stability, and order. And it ended basically with the Crimean War. So, like I said, there were revolts and revolutions. So the first one was in Spain. Ferdinand the seventh, I think, returned to the Spanish throne. He rejected the constitution that the assembly, called the court, had enacted during the Napoleonic period. This had some repercussions. It was not the only reason for independence in the Americas, but it was a big one. And so it started this independence movement in 1810, and by 1821, all of the colonies except Cuba were independent. Brazil, by the way, also became independent at this time period, but through a more peaceful path. There were some revolts in Russia, starting with the death of Alexander I in 1821. It was called the Decembrist Revolt. The troops loyal to the new czar crushed it. In Greece and the Balkan states, they were part of the Ottoman Empire, but they wanted to be independent from the empire, and so they started having a series of uprisings, beginning in about 1821. And finally, by 1827, the British, the French, and the Russians joined to support Greece, and eventually Greece became independent. Okay. There was another revolution in France. Actually, there's going to be several of them, but there was another one under Charles X, who ended up fleeing and was succeeded by Louis Philippe. And he ended up being unpopular and had another revolution for him. So, and that was, so he was in the Revolution of 1832, but also 1848. And there were a number of revolutions in 1848. And it was, kind of a coalition of the liberals, the socialists, and the nationalist movements against the conservative order. It started in France, of course, spread to Prussia, Austria, and some of the German states, also Italy and Hungary. All of them failed to create liberal republics or socialist states, either one. Some did have some limited constitutional and parliamentary reforms, but nothing on the order of, what we saw in England at that time. A couple of unifications happened in this period of time. That was the new nations Greece also, but, and these were Italy and Germany. So Italy had been under foreign power since about the 6th century. And for a long time. Anyway, so there were a couple of important names. So the first one was Giuseppe Mazzini, the Young Italy movement, and he kind of got some recognition by some people, and the focus in this period of time was in the kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia. The king was Emmanuel II, and one of his ministers was a count by the name of Camillo di Cavour. And he was really the person that was responsible for this unification. And that really wasn't his goal. He wanted to increase Piedmont and Sardinia's power. So he negotiated with Napoleon III for support. They pushed out the Austrians who were in control of that area. And then we get another person jumping in here who was Giuseppe Garibaldi. And his force was called the Red Shirts, and they were more peasants. And they wore red shirts, that way they got the name. But they moved out from the south, from Sicily, then over to Naples, and up that order. Now, Cavour didn't really care about the south, but they ended up having the whole thing, kind of united. But Piedmont, Sardinia, and King Emmanuel were definitely in charge for the early period of time. Okay. Germany was actually a unification, or was a bunch of different states, right? I'm sure I've often said the German states this, the German states that, right? So the architect of unification in Germany, or the German states, was their Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. He was the Chancellor of Prussia. And he was the person credited with this idea of Realpolitik, which is this philosophy that says, what you need to be is pragmatic and realistic. Don't worry about glory. Don't worry about moral principles. Just do what's going to work, right? That was him. Okay. In 1815, there was no Germany, just the Confederation. So the Prussian king was Wilhelm I, and his chancellor von Bismarck was the architect of all of this. Unification there was also achieved through war, the Franco-Prussian War. So they also got Napoleon III involved in that. Napoleon III was kind of involved in everything, right? Okay, and then we get to Russia. So Russia was probably the least modern and most conservative nation at the beginning of the 19th century. It was primarily an agricultural nation with the majority of the population classified as serfs. The rulers were czars. The Russian Orthodox Church was closely tied to the government. There was a small class of elite intellectuals, and the nobility and the church and everybody else were serfs practically. Russia fought Britain and France in the Crimean War, which was between 1854 and 1856. And by the way, I don't really need you to remember all these dates. I tell you so you can kind of place them in your little mental timeline there. So Russia had tried to assert control in the region of the Black Sea. And just to kind of put that into perspective here, a few years ago, I can't remember exactly how many years ago now, Russia went into the Crimea, which is this isthmus into the Black Sea that was under the control of Ukraine, and took it. Okay, so it's that same area that they're now fighting now. Crimea has been under Russian control for I don't know 5-8 years, something like that. But now they're trying to take over the rest of Ukraine. But it's that same. It has a lot to do with the control of the Black Sea. Okay. The Crimean War is also famous for the birth of the use of women as nurses in war. Florence Nightingale gets a lot of the credit, though there is your book. I was really glad your book talks about Mary Seacole, who was another woman who was very much involved, but because she was a Afro-Jamaican woman, she doesn't get the same credit as Florence Nightingale. In 1855, during the war, when Alexander II took the throne, he tried to modernize Russia. and he decided to emancipate the serfs, which sounds wonderful, right? Except they had to pay for their freedom. So the government would lend them money. They still had to pay them back. So they were still working in the same way in the same fields. But, they believed that serfdom was like kind of holding back their modernization. Okay. Um, okay. Victorian culture. This period in England was known as the Victorian era because Queen Victoria ruled from 1837 to 1901. She was the longest ruling monarch up until Elizabeth II. There were very carefully designed class and gender distinctions. I have read a lot about the irony that Victoria, a woman, was queen, was empress of India, was over this big, British empire, and she was not interested in promoting women's rights at all, at all. The working class, because we're in industrialization now, the working class was seen as weak and immoral. Labor movements, socialist parties were growing. Working class people wanted shorter working days. I mean, they were working 16-hour days. I mean, they were working under terrible conditions, very unsafe conditions, etc. So there were some scientific advancements. They started doing better city planning, sewers, putting in sewers to clean up the cities, to stop epidemics, that sort of thing. We see things like anesthesia, bacteriology, Louis Pasteur, pasteurization, that sort of thing. Natural history and biology. This is when Charles Darwin published his book on the origin of species. Gregor Mendel published his work on genetics, that sort of thing. We also see some social science and pseudoscience kind of things, especially social Darwinism. And the video that I ask you to watch really does a good job talking about that. I really encourage you to watch it. Herbert Spencer was kind of the father of social Darwinism. And what he was doing was taking Darwin's ideas and applying them to societies. Okay, so he's actually the person that coined the term survival of the fittest. He was a proponent of free market economics. He defined human races in biological terms, and he justified racial hierarchy. He said that non-whites were not just inherently inferior, they had stopped evolving while the white race continued to evolve. But he included in this anybody who was unfit, right? Alcoholics, promiscuous women, unwed mothers, criminals, people with disabilities, either, developmental disabilities or physical disabilities. Any of those people were unfit because they were lower on the evolutionary scale. This led to eugenics. I mean, eugenics basically says, hey, the best way to deal with this is just not to let these people procreate, right? Sterilize them. I've seen some videos of I don't think I have one here, but where babies are being born that are probably have some deformity or something, and basically the doctor kills the baby and then tells the mother that he was stillborn. Just some awful stuff like that, right? We also see the beginning of the field of sociology for all you sociologists out there. Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, those people were writing in this period of time. It's also because of all these things that are happening with industrialization, and people are getting more money and they have more free time, stuff like that. So we have this mass culture, mass production of culture. We get books and newspapers and periodicals, and it's the time of yellow journalism, which is like the sensational accounts of political events. Doesn't have to be true, okay? Theater, music, concerts, dances, museums, art, stuff like that more and more people, though not the really poor, but more and more people could actually partake of. Consumerism, we see the first department stores. The first department stores were in France, in Paris, but that but it spread around very quickly, right? Um, and we're seeing this, the growth of nationalism and national identity, and the importance of culture in all of that, and ideas of citizenship, that sort of thing. We see a rise in socialist parties, and just a whole lot of turning around of things. First wave of feminism happened in this time period. Most Europeans believed that there should be separate spheres for the genders. Women had few rights. They couldn't vote. They couldn't initiate divorce. And if they got divorced, they couldn't keep custody of their children. They couldn't pursue higher education. They couldn't open bank accounts. They couldn't own property. They couldn't initiate lawsuits or be witnesses or anything. Domestic violence was common because men were the head of the family, and they were basically given free rein to do whatever they needed to control the family, right? But this was starting to be questioned by some. It was influenced by the growth of liberalism. But people are starting to write about this. So the early goal was suffrage, the right to vote. They got some other rights, but they didn't get the right to vote then. That doesn't happen until the 20th century. But the best known feminists in this period were Emmeline Pankhurst and her two daughters, Christabel and Sylvia. We also see a rise in anti Semitism, or what your book calls modern anti Semitism, because if you think about it, anti Semitism has been around for as long as we know, right? With the Enlightenment, and the changes and the dismantling of the feudal system, Jews began to be emancipated, and they could move to Christian cities. They could own land. They could practice professions that previously had been banned for them, not in Russia, but in other places, right? They were blamed for a lot of things, though. They saw them, people said, the bad things about urbanization, the evils of modern capitalism, socialism, all these things are the fault of Jews, right? So we start to see this really a big growth of anti Semitic politics and parties. And that was all over. And it was in the United States at the same time, all right? And we don't really see that end until, if it did, after the Holocaust, right? So there was this modern conspiracy theory of global Jewish influence, and it was a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So there were a lot of people really jumping on this and reading these things and listening to this. And the Dreyfus Affair happened in the last decade of the century. So a French military officer named Alfred Dreyfus was framed for espionage, stripped of his rank, and imprisoned. This created a huge outcry. And an author, Emile Zola, really, he wrote letters and articles about it. And eventually, Dreyfus was exonerated and released. But it had become one of the defining characteristics, anti-Semitism had become one of the defining characteristics of the anti-liberal, authoritarian, right-wing politics of the time. The opposite of that was the Zionist movement. And the Zionist movement was led by a man called Theodor Herzl. And it was the idea that there should be a Jewish homeland. And so a lot of European Jews started moving to what they saw as their traditional homeland around Jerusalem. And that continues. And at some point, probably in the next unit, the British, who have control of that area after the First World War, kind of allow them to do that. So, but like any other time when people move in, there were already people there, and so we're still seeing the repercussions of all of that. Okay, so that's all I have. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please let me know.